Good morning. Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for having me here. Ever since I started at the Center on the Developing Child, I've heard about North Carolina being a leader in this field and about Smart Start. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be here to speak with you and to bring some of this new knowledge and new thinking down here to you, and hopefully to help advance your thinking and your work, which is so important to the kids of North Carolina. I guess the first thing I would say is, as you might have noticed from the bio, nowhere in there does it says I'm a brain scientist. All right? So I'm not. But I work with a lot of brain scientists. I work with neuroscientists and developmental psychologists and people who work in genomics and people who work in molecular biology. And for the most part, they have a tough time speaking to the general public about what they know. They have amazing conversations among themselves. When I go to the meetings, I call them my trash-talking neuroscientist friends. So what I do is help them figure out how to tell what they know to people who aren't embedded in their field. And to help people understand that really the science tells a story. And it does tell a story. It's a very compelling story. And so what I'm going to do today is try to share a little bit of that story with you and help you think about some ways in which you might be able to use that story to improve your work and improve the lives of kids where you are engaged with them. So if you ask people on the street, what are the most essential skills for success? I think you'll get answers that are very similar to this very short video that I'm going to show.
What are the fundamental skills and abilities for those kids?
Reading and writing.
What's happened over the last few years is we've kind of gotten away from the basics, arithmetic and English.
He needs to know his basics he in kindergarten. Know his little coloring and doing the little ABCs, his little numbers and stuff.
Definitely a competitive drive for children, you know. That always keeps you motivated.
Really, street smarts.
Communication skills. Responsibility, first of all.
So how does a kid get those skills and abilities?
It's all got to start at home with the parents.
I think a lot of it comes from parenting. Definitely at home through parents and that environment.
I think it's very important at home.
I think at home, hopefully.
Fundamentally, they should be getting them from their parents. And I think that's where a lot of the problem occurs, is they're not getting it from their home.
And how do you think they get these skills?
By someone, always showing them, what's right from wrong. They learn by what they see and what they hear.
So there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of common sense in that. What's missing? Anyone see anything missing? Come on, this is audience participation.
It's morning.
Nothing? They didn't mention
Early childhood programs.
They didn't mention schools. They didn't mention early learning providers, right? Anything else? Yeah, so I'm going to hold off on my answer to that because I'm going to play a little quiz with you here, all right? So this is from a study that measured one particular skill in early childhood and then followed those children through adulthood, through about 35 years old. And it tracked various outcomes for these kids. All right, so in this one, it was adult criminal convictions. So if these kids had that skill in large quantities at an early age, they're considerably less likely to have a criminal conviction when they're adults. If they had less of this skill, they had an over 40% chance of having a criminal conviction. That skill also correlated with better adult health outcomes. So this is a poor health index. So in other words, the lower it is, the better you're doing in health. and its substance dependence index. So obviously the less of that you have, the better you are in health. So the more you had of this skill, the better you did in health as an adult. The more you had of this skill, the better you did in accumulating wealth, in your socioeconomic status, and in your income. So, any guesses on what this one skill was? Very good. Self-control. Self-control, self-regulation are very closely related. And so, self-control is part of this constellation of skills that scientists call executive function. Some call them self-regulation. There's an ongoing debate in the scientific community that I will not subject anyone to about what is executive function and what is self-regulation and which one fits under which and all that stuff. But we kind of pulled them all together into this one group, and we'll say executive function and self-regulation, all combined. But it's a constellation of skills. And now I'm going to play what scientists would say are the skills for success.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Just look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this? A toolbox.
A toolbox.
So this is like providing kids with a toolbox of skills. It's like providing adults with a toolbox of skills that begins to develop in early childhood. So let's get into a little bit about what these skills are. But first, I told you it was audience participation. Everybody have a pencil? Okay, pen works. We're going to do this test that researchers actually do to measure executive function, particularly self-control, in young children. All right? Everybody ready? It's early, I know. Okay, here's how it goes. First of all, can you hear this? Okay, I'll do it there. So when I tap once, I want you to tap twice. When I tap twice, I want you to tap once. Everybody got it? Simple rules, okay? Here we go. Very good, very good. All right, you all pass.
We passed.
So 5-year-olds can do that exceedingly well. 3-year-olds can't do it at all. It's because the part of the brain that takes care of that handles that type of function hasn't matured enough in a 3-year-old to be able to do that test successfully on a regular basis. When a researcher, I stole that from a researcher named Clancy Blair, and when he first did that, and I was sitting in the audience, I noticed two things, and tell me if you think that you noticed the same things. I noticed that, first of all, it was harder than I thought it was going to be. I had to think about it, I had to actually concentrate on it. Second of all, in about 20 seconds, it got easier. We didn't do that very long time, and by the end, I had it down. And that was pretty good. So that tells me that, first of all, it takes real brain effort to apply these skills, and second of all, with practice, they get better. That's true for kids, and it's true for adults. So now we're going to get into the brain. We're going to talk a little bit about where these skills come from and how they develop. And in order to understand that, you need to know a little bit about how the brain develops in general. I'm sure that a lot of you in this room kind of know this, but I'm going to cover it really quickly for those who don't. This will be your 5-minute crash course in neuroscience. I promise I will not test you. So brain brains, think of it as like architecture, all right? So the first point is that brains are built over time. It starts in the earliest years of life, and the simple skills and simple connections that form in the brain come first, and the more complex skills and more complex connections build on top of what came before. Nothing, or everything builds on what came before it, right? So the second point is that in the brain, cognitive skills, emotional skills, social skills, behavioral skills, they're all inextricably intertwined. You can't develop one without the other. So the implications of this for programs is that if programs focus on one domain, like building academic skills, they're not going to be as successful unless they also focus on the other domains, the social domains, the emotional domains. Those are necessary because they're all connected. And third is that this interconnectedness in the brain builds a foundation, just like building a house. It's all connected. It's like you put up a framework, and then you put in the electrical, and then you put in the plumbing, and then you put up the walls. If you skip a step in there, you're going to have a weaker house. You're going to have a weaker foundation for the structure that's built. And brains are very much the same way. So a weak foundation in the early years means it's like having cracks in your foundation, or it's like skipping one of those steps. I don't think any of us wants to live in a house like that. So to get a little more granular and technical about this, so here, brains go through first a period of proliferation, neural proliferation. What this means is that the neurons are connecting to each other rapidly. In the early years of life, 700 new neural connections are formed every second. Think about that. 700 new connections. 700 more. 700 more in the early years of life. Though every connection that forms is part of that foundation. Now, in the beginning, those proliferate at a rapid pace, and then they start to prune. So what this shows is those neural connections proliferating and then starting to prune. That's not a bad thing. Doesn't mean you're losing your mind. What it means is your brain is getting more efficient. Right? It's pruning away the connections that aren't used. So there's this rapid proliferation at the beginning of the sensory pathways, and then of the language pathways, and then of the higher cognitive functions. So they build on one another. But if you look at this graph, it's kind of an odd graph, but that shaded part is the first year of life. So you can see how much is happening in those little brains. And the proliferation is actually a good thing. That's how our brains become, the pruning is really a good thing. It's how our brains become more efficient and learn the language we need to know rather than when babies are first born, they can learn any language in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So, but within 6 to 9 months, they've already started pruning away the neural circuits that would enable them to hear sounds in other languages that they're not hearing. How do these circuits get formed? Well, it's through experience. Genes provide the blueprint for this. It's like the blueprint of the house. But as we all know, anyone who's had some construction work done knows that things don't always work out the way the blueprint calls for. And you might find some asbestos in the walls, or you might, there's a lot of things that happen along the way, change orders and so forth. And experiences are the things that determine how those blueprints are carried out, right? So one of the most active ingredients in these kinds of experiences is what we call serve and return interaction. The neuroscientists would call this contingent reciprocity. We felt like that was kind of hard to remember. So we worked with them on, what does that really mean? And it's really actually quite a simple thing. It's this give and take. It's like serving up a ball in tennis or volleyball, or throwing a ball in a game of catch, right? Someone throws it up there, and if you don't have a partner to catch it and throw it back or hit it back, then it's not much of a game, right? And the same is true for brain growth. That babies serve up these opportunities, and they need caring, responsive adults in their lives to send them back, to return those serves. And that's what builds these connections in their brains. So I'm going to give you one example of how this works from the lens, or through the lens of language and literacy development. A lot of people are focused on third grade reading scores, right? So this is going to explain why, if you start in second grade or first grade, you're behind the curve, right? Because the foundation is laid in infancy. When a baby looks up and starts cooing or gurgling or, you know, batting those cute little eyes, it's kind of instinctual that we respond to that, and we gurgle and coo back, and maybe we'll say a word. They haven't said a word to us. We're just kind of raising that game up to another level a little bit when we do that. But these are building the foundational circuits in their brain that enable them to understand that there's a connection between the sounds that they make and the responses that they'll get from the world around them. That the people they care about most, the most important people in the world to them, respond when they make these sounds and do those actions. And they get a little older, they can actually point. And you'll follow their hand and you'll point. And they understand there's a correlation between their actions and the responses from the world around them. That prepares them for the next stage, where they might point at an object, and you might say, it's hard to see that picture from here, but say it's in a supermarket, and the baby is pointing at an apple or pepper, and the mom is bringing it over and saying, that's an apple. Right? So they start to, building on those earlier connections, they start to realize there's a connection between the sounds they've been making and the objects that they see, that those things have names. Then, with more help from adults, they start to realize that those objects and those actions that they've been seeing and hearing actually can be represented by marks on a page. Wow, that's a big revelation. And with help, they can learn, they can build on those skills, they can build on that foundation and learn how to decipher those marks on the page themselves. And eventually, to make them themselves. So each stage of this process builds on the stage that came before. And it's all about this interaction, this serve and return. So the early years are particularly important from a neuroscience perspective because of what they call plasticity. So if you are like me and sort of toward the far end of that curve, it's a little daunting. But all is not lost. It never gets to 0. Okay. If you extend that out to 90, even 100, it never gets to 0. All right? If every day you learn something, and if you remember it the next day, you formed a new neural circuit. And your brain has exhibited plasticity. It's a little bit scary. But what it does show is it takes a lot more effort to learn something new. It is harder to teach an old dog new tricks, right? So that upward curve is the physiological effort that's required for your brain to change and adapt. So if you look at the left-hand side of that, so let's forget about us old folks for a little bit here. If you look at the left side of that, think of the opportunity we have there, right? This is when the brain is maximally flexible, maximally adaptable. It adapts to all the experiences that it has with a minimum of effort. It's because of all that proliferation and pruning that's going on. It's designed to do that. That's a double-edged sword, all right? So it depends on what kind of experiences the child is having. If the child is having positive, supportive, responsive experiences, that's great. That sets the trajectory on an upward track. If the child is having no responsiveness, or adverse experiences, stress, then that means the adaptations the brain is going to make at that stage are all oriented toward those experiences. So you're going to have a brain that's overdeveloped in responding to danger, responding to anxiety, responding to fear, and underdeveloped in all those other good things that we want kids to have. So what is the effect of that if that happens? This is a study that looked at kids who were already, their families had already been reported for maltreatment. So they'd already experienced some form of maltreatment before age 3. So I think it was in the first 18 months they had experienced some form of maltreatment. And it looked at what other risk factors these kids had in their lives. Things like substance abuse in the home, violence in the home, teen mom, single mom, low education, low income, things like that. And what it found was that in addition to this maltreatment, that if they had 1, 2, or 3 risk factors, it increased their odds of having a developmental delay by age 3. If they had 4 or 5, it started to look pretty bad. If they had 6 or 7, there's a 90 to 100% chance that they're going to have a significant developmental delay by age 3. These are the developmental delays that put kids on IEPs and in the special education track and require expensive remediation in schools. So, aside from the kind of grim side of this, you can also look at the left side of this graph and see it as an opportunity. So if we can knock off 1, 2, 3, 4 of those risk factors in a child's life, you can make a significant difference in their odds of having a developmental delay. You don't have to cure everything. But if we can knock off a few of them, we can make a huge difference, not only for the kids, but for our budgets. And those educational goals that are so important. So what the science is doing is helping us understand why this happens. What is it about early adversity that gets under the skin and into the body and gives us these biological memories that cause these kinds of problems? So this short video is going to do its best to explain what that happens, and then I'll do my best to amplify on it.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So I'm going to recap a couple of things that I want to make sure people understand and remember about stress. First of all is we all experience stress, right? Who hasn't felt stress? And a lot of people think that stress is actually good for you, right? It actually kind of builds your resilience. And to some extent, that's true. There is such a thing as positive stress, even for little kids. It would be bad for kids not to have any stress at all in their lives. But this is little stress. It's the stress of, you know, having to take a nap when you don't want to, or that first day with a new caregiver. Not, you know, maybe having to share your toys or your cookies. But with a little bit of help from adults, those kinds of stresses can be, you know, the stress response system will activate, but it'll come back down pretty quickly. And that teaches your body how to have a healthy stress response. When the stressors get a little more serious, loss of a loved one, serious illness, injury, natural disaster, that's potentially more harmful to developing brains and developing bodies. But again, with the support of caring adults, these are kind of temporary things, and we can help kids calm that stress response down, and there will be no lasting damage from that. It's when the stressors get really serious and go on for a long time, and there's no caring, supportive, responsive adult in their lives to help them, that it becomes toxic to the circuitry in their brain and to that whole system that's designed to respond to stress. Think about it as if you were revving a car engine for days, weeks, months on end. What that would do to the engine of your car. It's kind of the same thing. You know, one scientist said to me speaking about neglect in particular, you know, think about when you're walking down a dark alley late at night all by yourself, and you're kind of looking around, and you've got that heart rate going, and you know, you're on alert, and you're kind of ready to fight or flight, right? He said, think about a child. If a child's not getting responses to their serves, they're feeling that same thing. And if they're being neglected, they may feel that all day. They might feel it for a week. They might feel it for months. They might even feel it for years. So think about what that would do to your body and your brain. So the stress then forms these kind of biological memories. And so it's natural to think about, well, sure, you know, if I had a lot of bad experiences as a kid, I might be more likely to be depressed as an adult. That makes sense. Might be more likely to have, you know, substance abuse problems. That makes sense. But a lot of people don't realize that there's also a connection to health issues later in life. In this case, this is a biological test of predisposition to heart disease. So in other words, it's a marker that shows that you have inflammation that would lead to heart disease at an earlier age than you might otherwise. And a control group of, this is a study that was done in New Zealand. So they measured kids from birth up through age 35 or so. And what they found was that the control group had about a 15, 20, 17% chance of having this marker in their blood. It's called C-reactive protein. Then if these people had depression at age 32, there's a known correlation between depression and heart disease. So they had about a 25% chance. If they were maltreated as a child, they had over a 30% chance of having this marker. And if they were maltreated and had depression at age 32, it was almost a 40% chance of having this marker of heart disease already at age 32. So there's a lot of data on the connection between early life stress and a variety of health issues. So, and I'm not going to dwell on it because we're about early learning here, but I want to make the case it's not all about early learning, right? It's also about lifelong health and about lifelong behavior. So for about 40, 50 years or so, there's been a model of early childhood policy and practice that's been largely based on the idea that if you provide some combination of parenting education and sound nutrition for kids and stimulating experiences for kids and health promoting environments, you'll have kids on a healthy trajectory. And what we've seen is that the kids who experience serious adversity, that doesn't work for them. And the science can tell us that perhaps this is because that adversity is throwing them off that trajectory. It's overpowering all the good things we do for them. So that would lead to perhaps another approach, which would be, in addition to providing all these good things, what we need to do is address those sources of toxic stress. And we need to address those effects of toxic stress after kids have already experienced it. And if we can provide that kind of buffer zone, then maybe we'll get those kids on the same trajectory as everybody else. So that's something that policies can do. It's something that we can do in our communities. It's something that practice can do, right? And one of the ways to address the effects of toxic stress is to give kids, and adults for that matter, the skills that will help them to maintain control over their actions and to give them a sense of personal control. And we think that executive function is probably one of the keys to that, both in adults and in kids. Executive function is kind of a mouthful. Executive function and self-regulation is even more of a mouthful. So we've started talking about this as an air traffic control system for your brain. That was before the sequester, though, so I'm not sure it works as well as it did a couple of months ago. But it does raise actually an interesting point in that you know, stress can also act sort of as a furlough of your air traffic control system, right? I think we've all experienced moments when we didn't feel like we had all of our executive function working as well as we'd like it to. So what that means is we can have these skills, but we have to work at keeping them. It takes practice, right? So this constellation of skills, this air traffic control system, is the group of skills that helps us to focus on multiple streams of information, to set goals, to make plans, to make decisions, to adjust when things change. We don't expect them to go the way they do, to resist impulsive actions. Because of what they enable us to do, they're really this biological foundation for both school readiness and also employability and good health. So I'm going to dive a little deeper in what these skills are. All right? So the first type of skill is what they call inhibitory control. That's also maybe self-control. It's the idea that you filter thoughts and impulses to resist temptations or distractions. The example I have up here is the classic marshmallow test. Anybody know about the marshmallow test? Some yes, some no. Okay, well, this little boy is trying to resist eating that marshmallow because he's been told if he does resist, he'll get 2 when the researcher comes back into the room. It's a famous test, and they've actually now followed the kids who did the original one for like 40 years and found that they had significantly better, kids who had stronger inhibitory control, the kids who were able to resist eating that marshmallow. That one little thing did much better in work, in school, and in health, and in all these domains that we talked about. They, you know, more likely to graduate college, etc. Second area is working memory. This is what enables you to have and use information in your mind for short periods of time. So it's not enough just to be able to remember something. It's also important that you need to be able to use that. So it's obviously something that you would need in good supply to do long division, as we've shown there, but there's a lot of other just kind of daily tasks that it's helpful to have. Mental flexibility or cognitive flexibility is the third area. This is what it enables us to adjust as things change, situations change. Also, you know, to adjust to different rules. So, you know, for little kids, it might be inside voice, outside voice. For adults, it might be, well, you can talk one way with your friends, but when you go to work or a job interview, you better talk a different way or dress a different way. And so it's making those adjustments. right? So what do these look like in adults? Same set of skills, right? Inhibitory control might be that diet you're having a hard time sticking to. Might be not yelling at somebody in a traffic jam. It might be not hitting a child who won't stop crying. Working memory, pondering something, remembering what you're supposed to say in a presentation, remembering the steps of a task that you need to do for your job or at home. Mental flexibility is adjusting, keeping two sets of rules in mind, coming up with a plan B and a plan C when things don't work out the way you thought they did. That middle picture, I'm going to test your working memory. What was that middle picture?
Cooking.
Cooking, okay. What she was doing was cooking and also looking at her laptop. I interpreted that as she's working at home. She's maybe doing some work and she's over here on the stove. Those are two very different sets of rules you have to keep in mind, right? That takes some mental flexibility to jump back and forth between those things. Good working memory, by the way, Stephanie. This is a compilation of tests of executive function skills. That there are a range of tests that you can apply at different ages. And so researchers pulled all these together to show when we develop proficiency in these different skills. And there's some really important information in this graph. So if you look at that, that's a really extended window of development. When you think about that first graph I showed of neural proliferation and pruning, right? That was how much happened in the first year of life. Well, this is the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex has the longest developmental trajectory of any other part of the brain, right? So you'll see there between about 3 and 5, the preschool years, look at that peak of development of skill proficiency and executive function skills. That's a huge opportunity in preschool to help build the foundation for these skills. But I also want to point out, those of you who have teenagers in the house, as I do, there's a little peak up there around 15 to 20, 15 to 23 or so. So if you're still stumbling over the shoes of your teenager in the hallway, don't despair. There's still some executive function development to happen. They still have an opportunity to pick some of those things up. What it also means from a policy perspective is, think about the age of the caregivers in many of our early learning, especially child care programs, and the age of some of the young mothers who are having kids for the first time, kind of between that 17 and 23 or so age. Many of them may not have had the opportunity to develop their skills between 3 and 5, but it's not too late. You can still learn these skills. You can learn them by coaching, by practicing, by mentoring, by scaffolding these skills. So we have an opportunity not to kind of get at both ends of this curve. So now I'll let the actual neuroscientists tell you a little bit about how these skills develop in the brain.
How does executive function develop?
7 and plus 4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become because you're helping to strengthen those neural connections.
So what are some of the things we can do to help build those neural connections? This slide comes from some work that Adele Diamond did. She's one of the nation's leading experts on executive function. And she did a literature review of all of the studies that have been done, of all of the programs that have tried to build executive function in young kids in one way or another. And she came out with these, what we call effectiveness factors. These are the things that were shown to have some impact on building executive function skills, the things that we can do in programs with young kids. First thing is, well, the first thing is, I love this quote from her article. The most effective way to improve executive function and academic achievement is probably not to focus narrowly on those alone, but also to address children's emotional and social development and physical development. And here's some specific examples of that. Addressing stresses in their lives. So that's both externally, what can we do about those sources of stress, but also giving them some techniques to deal with stress, helping them learn how to bring that stress response system back down. That can be even with little kids, you can do things like breathing exercises or taking a minute to think and calm down. And certainly it's modeling your own responses to stressful situations. So it's giving them some techniques. Fostering social interactions. Some of the programs that have been most effective at building executive function really focus on creative play, which is wonderful because that's what kids want to do anyway. But if you think about it, they have to take a role, they have to devise a role, they have to live inside that role, inside the rules of that role. They have to engage with other kids who have a different role, so they have to understand what that role is. They have to adjust as somebody else enters the game or something else changes in the game. So that's drawing on the beginnings of all those executive function skills. They have to remember those things. They have to adapt. Progressively increasing the demand on these skills. So video game manufacturers have this down, right? They have this nailed. It's, as Vygotsky would say, it's that zone of proximal development. It's that zone where you're being pushed to the limit of your ability, maybe just a little bit beyond, but not so far beyond that you get really frustrated. So it's doing that same kind of thing with the beginnings of these executive function skills. Practice, practice, practice. And physical exercise. So there's a lot of ways that exercise plays into this. One is that it's a stress reducer. Another is a lot of these games, they have roles, they have rules. You have to adjust to changing demands. So you think about something as simple as soccer or t-ball or something like that for little kids. They have to remember all those things. They have to use all those things. They have to adapt. They have to inhibit their rushed responses and so forth. So that's a good thing to have. We brought a lot of this information to a cross-agency working group in Washington State a couple of years ago. And the Department of Early Learning in Washington was one of the first to kind of seize on it and realize, this is something we need to do. And they had an opportunity. They had some Race to the Top funding. They were already starting to revise their early learning guidelines. They were already starting some professional development. So this fit right into what they were already doing. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how they incorporated executive function into their early learning guidelines. So, and at different ages too. So these guidelines are from birth to 8. And they're designed for both parents and caregivers. So remember and follow directions. They had originally just said follow directions. But when we talked about executive function, they realized, well, first they have to remember them, right? Listening to others and responding, remembering what was said and gaining information from that. 16 to 36 months, you can begin to enjoy turn-taking games. And they have their own little marshmallow test there. Adjusting your behavior, inside voice, outside voice. Games like Simon Says, where you have to adjust the rules and so forth. So those are now built in to their guidelines, and they also created this online professional development module, which is accessible to the public. You can go look at it and send people there at that URL, and we'll give the slides so you don't have to write that whole long URL down. But if you're interested, it's worth looking at. And I'm going to give you a little taste of what's inside that module. Partly what they do is show footage of experts talking about certain aspects of executive function, and then what it looks like in a classroom setting.
We all remember the game Red Light, Green Light, or the game Simon Says. Simple games, just send kids off to do them, right? Well, you're going to see in Red Light, Green Light that there are going to be kids who, once you say green light and they get going, they just can't stop when you say red light. That takes huge inhibitory control skills, because you're all set to run to that finish line and you have to stop.
As the children walk into the gym, it's a wide open space. Their first impulse is to run around screaming. In order to contain them briefly while we get the material set up, which is balls or scooter boards or whatever we're going to be using in the gym, we have them all line up on the wall. Lining up on the wall is not a very interesting task for a 3 or 4-year-old child. They're going to lose interest very quickly. So we actually started that game in order to provide a real-life opportunity. What we actually needed to do was provide one teacher or two teachers an opportunity to get away from the kids and get the balls out. The magic word game also provides the children an opportunity to work on executive function skills by controlling their impulses and waiting until just the right moment, and then running off when the correct word is called. Pony! So it actually serves us two purposes. We're able to have just one teacher lead the entire group for that moment while the other teachers are busy with supplies, so it eases the transition, and it gives the kids an opportunity to do something fun, building their skills, instead of just waiting in line.
I like to say, if you don't know what inhibitory control is, after you see that video and the little kid who's holding it all in, then you may never know what it is. So I'm going to pull it all together and then wrap it up here. So we're going back to the brain here. These are kind of the three categories of executive function, self-regulation skills. They translate into these and many other kinds of skills. You need to remember, you need to filter information as it's coming. You need to be able to focus on different streams of information. Plan. Monitoring is one we didn't spend a whole lot of time on, excuse me, but it's an important one. It's the ability to recognize emotions in yourself and in others. To recognize that other people are having emotions and to be able to identify what they are. It's a really important part of social interaction and teamwork and all those kinds of things, is to be able to understand those two different things. And they don't necessarily come naturally. You might have to work on those skills with kids. And the rest we've all talked about. And those clearly lead to a wide range of outcomes throughout life. Right? So in learning and work, it's things like following multi-step directions, avoiding distractions, planning and executing on that plan, managing a long-term assignment. We all know kids can have a hard time with that, right? And many adults can too. Adjusting to new rules or seeking an alternate solution when the first way doesn't work. It's also behaviors that I think we all value, both in work and in school. Teamwork, leadership, foresight, being goal-directed. Think of how important that is just in life, to succeed in life. Being able to set a goal and apply yourself to achieving it. Being aware of yourself and others, and being adaptable. Also health, I've mentioned health. Having executive function skills can help with stress reduction, can help with sticking to that diet and that exercise regimen that's so hard to do. Resisting pressure to take risks. There's a lot of risky behaviors out there and a lot of peer pressure to engage in them. So having that good inhibitory control can help you to resist those things. So how do we do it? Well, the strategies here are basically all the things that were on that previous slide, so I won't spend any time going over them again. But Those are all things that we can do. Everybody in this room, we can do these things not only with our own kids, but we can help the caregivers who spend so much time with these kids help support those things. Parents can do it. Professional caregivers can do it. Teachers can do it. Any professional, any person who spends significant time with children can support kids in their practicing of these skills. We can model those things, these skills. We can engage with kids without taking over for kids, without doing it for them. We can engage with them and get to their level. We can be reliable, right? We can be there for them. We can be responsive to their needs and to their serves. We can guide them without telling them how to do it or what to do. We can guide them in the direction that they need to go, and we can protect them from these sources of stress in their lives. And the environments that we create for kids must be safe. They need to feel safe, both emotionally and physically. They need to provide opportunities for kids to be creative, to use their creative sides and to try new things and experiment and explore safely. And they need to be stable both economically and emotionally. That's getting to that safety issue. If we can do all these things, then, and apply all those strategies, then we can develop those capacities in the brain, and people will have them for life. There's a lot more on our website, including many of the videos you saw, and working papers and briefs and all kinds of things if you're interested in the science. And I'll stop there.